Are you tired of being disappointed by Intel? The industry-leading supplier of processors has failed to transition to mobile. Now they're fending off threats from ARM suppliers even beyond the mobile space. What's going on in Intel, and should investors be hopeful for the future? Welcome to Invest in the Family Radio, a podcast about learning to invest. My name is Brian Bain, and I'm your host. At Invest in the Family Radio, we believe that you can become a great investor. How? By building the right plan and then sticking to it. According to Warren Buffett, that's what it takes. Everything we do here is meant to help you accomplish both, so thank you for joining us. You can always find more at investinthefamily.com and subscribe to the podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, and the Google Play Store. And if you'd like to receive the next best thing to a transcript of this episode, that is my personal notes taken during the interview. They can be yours. To get these notes, simply text the word family notes, one word, family notes, to the number 44222, or visit investinthefamily.com and sign up, and we'll be sure to get you taken care of. Do you like shopping for insurance? Of course you don't. It can be a terrible experience, especially when it comes to life insurance. If you have loved ones that you want to take care of financially after you're gone, then you may want to consider term life insurance, and Policy Genius is the easiest way to get insurance, period. At Policy Genius, you can figure out what you need, compare the top policies, get covered, and save. If you want to save on term life insurance, go to investinthefamily.com/policygenius. That's investinthefamily.com/policygenius for access created specifically for Investor in the Family listeners. I do get a small commission if you use my link, which costs you nothing. It's a win-win. Visit investinthefamily.com/policygenius for more info and have the most enjoyable insurance shopping experience you've ever had. I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Mark Hibben. Hey, Mark, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot. Good to be back.
Absolutely. Well, and today I want to talk about Intel and other processor chip making companies. And There's a lot of changes going on in the processor landscape. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening and what that means for Intel?
Sure. This has been one of my big themes since I first started blogging about technology businesses, since around 2012, 2013. It's what I call a paradigm shift in the whole semiconductor processor industry. The old PC paradigm, which Intel was kind of right smack in the middle of, was you had a company like Intel that designed and built the processors, and they weren't built for any kind of particular computing device. They were just kind of generic processors with varying capabilities, and they just sold them wholesale to the PC OEMs. The OEMs would slap them in a box, combine it with a Windows or some other operating system, and bang, you had a PC. And that was the commodity processor model that sustained us through the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century. The paradigm shift is something that Apple kind of instigated. Instead of buying a commodity processor, they decided to design their own processor for their mobile devices. So for iPhone and iPad, they started designing their own, what they call custom SoCs, or systems on chip, which they're called systems on chip because they consolidate an awful lot of functions that would normally have been in like an Intel chipset with multiple chips. And so they cut Intel, or they cut out any kind of commodity chip supplier completely out of the loop. At the same time that they started doing that, they weren't going to, build a whole chip fabrication facility so that they could build their chips. So they went out to what are called semiconductor foundries like TSMC, even Samsung, and they had those foundries build the chips for them. And the advantage for Apple and for other companies that followed suit, and Samsung and Huawei are examples of companies that followed suit in terms of mobile devices, is that they could really custom tailor the design of the processor to be exactly what they wanted. Instead of having to accommodate sort of a generic processor that might have a lot of capability that they didn't need, or which didn't do things that they did need, they could design exactly the perfect processor for, say, the next model iPhone or the next model iPad or an Apple TV. It's a completely different way of doing this whole process of building a personal computing device. And as as consumer interest and spending have shifted to mobile, it has tended to sort of put more emphasis on the new paradigm. And it has kind of left Intel behind with the old PC paradigm. And that's kind of where things stood as of, say, 2013, when Intel decided, well, we're going to get into mobile. And we think Intel architecture processors are just as good as anyone else's custom processors, and we think we can be the guys in mobile. And back when that was happening, I got an awful lot of feedback, especially from Intel bulls who were saying, "Oh, the commodity model is going to completely overwhelm these custom SoCs, and companies like Apple are just going to end up going with the commodity model because that's the thing that ended up being dominant in personal computers." It didn't happen. And I think one of the most interesting questions in technology today is why it didn't happen. Because by 2015, Intel had bailed out of mobile devices completely by the end of 2015. They basically announced they were giving up. There wasn't going to be an Intel smartphone. They discontinued the development on that product line. There weren't going to be Intel tablets. They gave up completely. And I think the industry is still trying to sort of get its arms around that. I consider that whole thing about as significant as the development of the internet, believe it or not.
Whoa. Wait, okay. The fact that Intel has given up on mobile, you say is as significant as the development of the internet?
The paradigm shift.
Oh, the paradigm shift. Okay.
The paradigm shift. The paradigm shift was what really forced Intel to give up. The paradigm shift proved to be more economically efficient. I'm not exactly certain why, but I think it has an awful lot to do with the fact that, along with the paradigm shift, the guys who were implementing the new paradigm, like Samsung and Apple and Huawei, they were building ARM architecture processors, and there seems to be some inherent economic advantages to ARM architecture. I'm not exactly sure. No one's ever done a really, really careful analysis. The best analysis I've seen was actually done by William Holt of Intel in an Investor Day presentation from 2015. He actually did a side-by-side comparison of a couple of different ARM processors that were Apple SoCs and compared them with some devices from Intel. And he doesn't draw I think what is probably the obvious conclusion. He just kind of left it for everyone to figure out for themselves. But the basic conclusion that I think is there in his work, and people can go back and look at his charts because they're on the Intel website, is that for all things being equal, if the processors are roughly equal in performance, if they're being fabricated by the same process node, then the ARM processor requires fewer transistors and less area to do the same equivalent work that the Intel processor does. And what that means is that it has an inherent cost advantage that there's no way for Intel to ever overcome.
Wow.
And that's something I can't prove, unfortunately. I mean, I really can't prove it. I think I've basically just inferred it from what happened with Intel's attempt to get into mobile devices. I think that, when back in 2013, the Intel bulls were all saying, well, Intel's got a huge process advantage because they're going to be doing 14 nanometer FinFET, and they've got much more powerful processors. It's game over. ARM can't possibly compete. Well, I think Intel certainly showed that that Intel processors could be as energy efficient, as powerful as an ARM processor, and that you really could put an Intel processor in a smartphone, and they did. There were a few smartphones made with Intel processors. What they didn't show, and I think what the Intel bulls never really managed to figure out, was that they could also be, economically competitive with ARM architecture. That they could actually build the processors for the same amount of money and still have a good margin and make a profit.
So if Intel, their shift to mobile was based upon the theory that the commodity processor would win in mobile as well.
Yeah, they thought x86 would become dominant in mobile. They saw no reason why it couldn't. And
obviously by them pulling out, they determined that wasn't true. Why can't, or maybe this is the big question, why can't Intel, or hasn't Intel shifted to more of an ARM type model?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. I think for a long time it was just the fact that, companies, if they get invested in a certain technology, they naturally want to try to realize as much of a return on that investment as possible. Sure. So I think Intel was just trying to squeeze as much return out of their investment in x86 as they possibly could. And I think they also genuinely believed that they could be competitive partly by virtue of having the process advantage that they had. Now, my most recent article on their Q3 earnings, I pointed out that they're basically well on the way to losing that process advantage. That the ARM foundries are probably going to catch up this year.
Wow.
And yeah, so without that process advantage, then that made competing in mobile much more problematic for them anyway. Because you could kind of conceive of a scenario where the process advantage would overcome whatever inherent economic disadvantage the architecture might have, and you can make a case that they could compete on that basis. But losing the process advantage, then that made it a lot dicier, and that's so to answer your question. Well, why can't they just invest in ARM? Well, they're starting to swing ever so gradually in that direction, and I think the movement that we're seeing initially is in the foundry area. They have some foundry agreements to build ARM processors for smartphone vendors. This is a new thing for them. They had to actually license some intellectual property from ARM in order to do that. So that was a big step for them. And I think that was probably a little hard for some of the older, longtime executives at Intel to swallow that. But, I called it a step in the right direction. I think they can continue along that pathway. I think they must. Even though I can't prove that ARM architecture has that economic advantage, I think there's a wealth of circumstantial evidence that supports, that conclusion. And if that is the case, if that truly is something where Intel architecture is disadvantaged, what's Intel going to do when someone like Qualcomm comes up with a credible ARM-based server processor? Qualcomm's working on it right now, and they're not the only company that's doing that. It could really eat into what has been a key profit center for Intel, which is the data center.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. Is if the trend in PCs continues to not be positive, and that being obviously a significant profit center for Intel. And if they're not successfully making the shift into mobile, then what is left for them? And then you mentioned servers and maybe some more commercial type products, but it seems like they're It doesn't seem very positive from what I'm understanding the situation to be right now. They don't seem to be making very good decisions in terms of moving forward.
Well, that's been my complaint about Intel for a couple of years, and I've at various times been pretty hard on their management, especially in 2014, 2015, when they were really pushing their commodity tablet processors into the market. It did hurt Apple quite a bit. That was when we saw very, very significant declines in iPad sales. And they were basically, they were selling these processors for roughly a fifth of the going rate. I mean, Intel was. Yeah, and they were taking $1 billion loss every quarter on it. You know, it was kind of ridiculous. And they were pretending that they weren't actually subsidizing the processors, even though they were. And they were awfully proud about how many they were selling. They'd brag about, well, this quarter we sold 10 million processors, and we're the biggest merchant vendor in the world now. But, you know, it was something that was kind of artificial and a product of what they call contra revenue. And in fact, the products that were based on the processors were terrible. I mean, they were just awful. They were, these really, really cheap, under $200 tablets with Android operating systems that by the time they reached the consumer, the Android systems were already obsolete, and the manufacturer wasn't going to be updating them anyway.
The kind of tablets that you see offered on like a Groupon deal or something.
Oh yeah. I mean, they really poisoned the waters. Because they flooded the market with these things, and then I think they created the impression in a lot of consumers' minds that this is what a tablet is. Mm-hmm. And the tablet part of the market is still recovering, and Apple is still recovering from this.
Well, so go ahead.
So I think the basic takeaway that they need to get more into ARM and just sort of let go of the older legacy x86 technology. I think that is the right answer. I mean, a lot of other companies have already gone through multiple kinds of transitions like this. Apple has gone through transitioning from original Motorola processors to PowerPC to Intel. They regularly obsolete their old technology the way iPhone kind of made iPod obsolete. It's just something that you have to accept, I think, in technology-based industries, especially consumer industries. And I think it's high time for Intel to just sort of let go of this and move on.
Yeah, it sounds, and I mean, I don't know if we have time to get into all this kind of discussion, but it makes me, you mentioned management generally, but it makes me wonder, who is the CEO? How long has he been there?
Brian Krzanich.
Yeah, so how long has he been there? Is he kind of like an old...
Oh, he's up through the ranks, gotcha. Intel executive.
Okay. It almost sounds like Microsoft problems. Microsoft, I feel like, has struggled for a long time trying to get like a fresh mindset or someone in there who can really move into the future. Well, maybe the new guy is able to do that. I don't know. We don't have to talk about Microsoft, but I feel like there's some level of similarity there of just not having the kind of leadership that is creating the culture of innovation that probably used to thrive at Intel, and instead they're, just stuck in their days, essentially.
They did make some changes, and I think it was partly in recognition of the failure of the mobile strategy. They brought in an executive from Qualcomm, and he's been shaking things up. They put him in charge. They gave him sort of a supervisory role over the Internet of Things group and the client computing group, which had been the PC group combined with the mobile group. And they brought this guy in, and I think he has been shaking things up. So I think there is reason to hope. And actually lately I've been quite a bit more optimistic about Intel, especially after they announced the foundry deals. So, I think things are going in the right direction. Sometimes it can be hard these are very, very big ships, and they can be hard to make them change direction. And, But there does seem to be some good progress there, and of course, no one's saying that they should just stop making x86 processors because they've still got a huge business there, and we all use them.
And Intel, I mean, they still really are like the huge gorilla in this space. I mean, the other companies, I guess their major competitors would be companies like Qualcomm, AMD, Samsung, right? And of those companies, I'm assuming they're still the big monster, aren't they? Size-wise and
by
power-wise?
far. Yeah. I think Qualcomm and then Texas Instruments and NXP. I forget the exact ranking of the size of the companies.
Okay. Great.
But Apple, if you can, one of the points I made in an article a while back, I just thought I'd bring this up in passing. Talking about the paradigm shift. If you look at Apple just as a semiconductor company, they're actually one of the biggest semiconductor companies in the world now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, considering they're making chips for every one of their piece of hardware, that's a lot of chips.
Yeah, they're making everything. They're for all their mobile devices. They obviously still use Intel for their notebooks and desktop computers, desktop Macs. But that there's been a lot of speculation that eventually, as Apple's ARM processors become more powerful and capable, that they'll eventually slip those into Macs as well.
Wow. Well, Mark, thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. Intel and specifically Intel has been a company that I've been very interested in for a long time, just as an outside observer. And this has been really helpful for me, getting a feel for what's going on in the industry, and I'm sure it has been for our listeners as well. So thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have another point? Oh, no, go for it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I pulled the trigger too quick.
Yeah, one point I did want to make, and that was about the impact of the paradigm shift being as significant as the development of the internet. The reason why I believe that's the case is that if you look at how many computing devices have been put in the hands of people who didn't have access to computing devices at all, and therefore no access to the internet, the mobile device paradigm shift has affected more people than the development of the internet has.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, because you're talking, companies like Google regularly talk about the next billion or the next couple of billion users. Those billions of users are all going to be using mobile devices. They're not using PCs.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Yeah, when you said it earlier, it almost felt like an Al Gore moment, but I knew you had a different view on it. Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah.
That makes sense though, because if the PC, brought us the internet, and now with ARM, we now have mobile devices, and so the internet is in the hands of vastly more people because of that. So no, that makes
exactly.
sense.
That's been the big change. Yeah, people tried to create low-cost PCs that they could distribute in the third world. It never really worked.
Yeah, I do a lot of work in the third world, and I can attest to that, and I know why. But you know what? A lot of those people have smartphones.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Mark, thanks. This has been great.
Okay. All right. You're welcome.
Hope you enjoyed today's show with Mark Hibben. Remember, you can get full show notes with links and any other info you may want at investinthefamily.com. Don't forget to subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Store. And if you want to receive my summary sheet of personal notes and highlights from the show, simply text the word family notes, one word, family notes, to the number 44222, or visit investinthefamily.com and sign up. And we'll be sure to get you taken care of. This is Brian, and thanks for joining the family. The information and opinions contained on this podcast are for educational purposes only. The information does not consider the economic status or risk profile of any specific person. The information and opinions expressed should not be construed as investment trading advice and does not constitute an offer or an invitation to make an offer to buy and sell securities.